Saucier, this is a video lesson for Python programming, event input. Input, before we were working with graphics and animation, came from the input function. The input function pauses the processing of a program, waiting for the user to press enter on the keyboard. And what the program gets with the input function is a string. And we've learned to respond and use that kind of input. Event input is a little bit different. We don't use the input function to get events, an event being the user interacting with the mouse or keyboard or any other peripheral device on a computer. We get that information in what we call the event queue, and we get it from the get function that is a part of Pygame. We have included this line of code in all of our previous lessons with graphics and animation. We needed to because we needed to empty the place in memory, the queue in memory, of all of the events that are coming in. Because if we don't empty that event queue, that place in memory, then it could stall or cause our graphics windows to stop and our programs wouldn't work. So we've always included this, a for loop to get the events but not respond to them, because all we're doing is passing every time we get an event. Now we're going to respond to those events, whatever they may be. I have started this lesson code with stub 1, but I've included lots of stuff already. I've programmed stuff into that stub so that we can focus on the event queue. The things that I've prepared is creating a class called object. So it will create a thing that is going to move along the screen so that we can see our input affecting that animation. I've also created a few more booleans than the stub has: pause, color change, and duplicate. The input that we give our computer is going to affect these booleans, and the boolean values are then going to affect things that the user experiences and sees on the screen. Pause is going to stop and start the animation. Color change will change the colors of the objects that are drawn, and duplicate will be used to create more instances of the object. The program's going to start with 1. That one beginning object was created with this code. I have a dictionary to manage my instances, and I create one object here. Then in the frame loop, I have a process to duplicate or create more instances. And like I said before, that is on condition that the duplicate boolean is true. What happens if boolean is true, it immediately turns that false, so this part of the code only runs once every time the duplicate boolean is true, and it creates a new object and puts it in the dictionary. I have a simple algorithm for moving or changing the position attributes of the object, and that is done on condition of pause being false. If the program is not paused, then things move. And things are moving by choosing at random and the integer -1, 0, or 1 for both dimensions, so horizontal and vertical, and then changing their positions. So this is going to shake around randomly as the graphics loop processes. I also have the drawing of my instances. It's simply a circle, and the Boolean color change will affect what color is drawn. So true or false will get a different color. I also have, on condition of pause being true, the drawing of a rectangle on the screen. That's a visual effect. So if pause is true, not only will the animation not happen, the changing of the position will not happen, so it'll look like the motion has been paused to the user, but it's also going to draw a rectangle to visually clue the user in that we intentionally stopped the motion. And finally, we have the event queue that we are going to code in order to accept input and then affect these changes that we've talked about. Let's take a look at what we're starting with. We have one instance of the object, which is drawn as a blue circle, shaking around, moving at random, quite quickly. It only moves 1 pixel most of the time per frame. So it's moving many pixels because we're processing fast. That's it so far. Now the event queue. This is a for loop because when the frame is being composed, there could be no events or many events ready in memory in order to get with the get function. Every time we call the get function, the next event in the order in which they were inputted from the user is then becomes an instance that we are representing by the variable event in this for loop, the iterating variable, and the place in memory then does no longer has that event. So once we get the event out of the memory, then it's outside of memory, and all the other ones that are waiting to be gotten are then still remain in the queue, and the value of our iterating variable event becomes an instance of whatever that event is. So what is an event? We can print the iterating variable event to see its value. And the print will show up in the interpreter. There is many events that are coming in because mouse motion on the graphic screen is processing as fast as the computer can and showing it as an event. There's information with each event. If we're going to read most of it, we need to be able to see it. And we have to minimize. The events are only going to happen like mouse motion if your mouse is on top of the graphic screen, because that's where the program is processing the events, is in the execution of what's happening on this graphic screen. If we move the mouse outside, then we don't get the events of the mouse motion. So if I pause a moment or I don't move the mouse, then there is no input anymore. The motion of the mouse is an event, and we can read the text from the bottom that there is a number associated with that description of mouse motion, and inside the parentheses we can see the attributes that the event instance has. So mouse motion has an event number of 1024, and it has attributes post for position. That would be the position of the mouse, rel and buttons, window, etc. We're going to make use of, in a moment, the buttons of the mouse. I want to create pausing. I want to make pausing work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the space bar. I pressed it and released it, and I'm observing that event of that key press. I can do it several times and read this information. So the event number is changed. We've got an event number, I'm reading third from the bottom, 771, a description of that event, text input, and then attributes for that type of event, text and window. Now notice that the text, that's a single length empty string because the text was literally space. There's also 2 other events associated with that, key down and key up. And the attributes Unicode, key, mod, scan code, window, those may be all important to you if you want to respond to them. What I'm going to make use of is the pressing of the key down. So if I press, it'll repeat the text input, but if I press the space bar down, that's distinct than the release. So we have, and I could write this down if I didn't have it memorized, that I want to put in my code and remember the event number the event number 768 for key down and 769 for key up. Also, the key number that was pressed, the spacebar key number, is 32. So I would write that down if I needed to remember it and go back to my code. In the event queue for loop, the first thing I want to do is make a condition if the event type is in the list of the numbers for key downs, key pressing down. And those event numbers we can observe by printing the event, but I remember them to be 2 and 768. I'm going to make a comment that this is for key down event types. This condition will be true if the event was the pressing down of a key. The reason why I have a list of the event numbers is because Pygame 2.0.0 changed the numbers of the event types. 768 is the new event number for a key down, 2 is the old number for it. So the code file that I'm writing here can work with any version of Pygame that's out there, the new and the updated. But I want the pressing of specifically the space bar. So on this condition being true, I simply got a key down detected. Now I need to write another condition and test or check that the event key, the key attribute of the event instance, is equal to 32, which is the ordinal number of the space bar. If that's the case, if that event is true, then I know that I press the space bar down. And this block of code then is where I would respond to having detected that type-specific type of input. And what do I want to do? I want my pause Boolean to be reassigned to be the opposite of what it was. Pause is equal to not pause. If pause is true, it'll become false. If it was false, it'll become true. So the space bar is now a toggle of pause on and off to the user's perspective. Otherwise, if the key down event was not spacebar, then I'm going to print my own event output. I'm going to make a string that recognizes that there was a key press and then have an integer be the event key number, the key attribute of the event that is then printed as part of this message. So let's see what I got when I run my code. I have my instance that's shaking around, and if I press the space bar just once, I pressed and released, then I get my green rectangle to visually suggest to the user that something intentional happened, and the motion is not, the motion algorithm, the change of position, is not happening because it only happens on condition of pause being true. So it looks like to the user that things got paused. And if I press the space bar again, that turns off. I can toggle it with the space bar. Nice simple effect. What happens if I press a different key? Well, I get an error because I spelled event of any. So if I change that, I will not get that error. And instead, pressing the spacebar still works, but if I press another key, then I'm not getting the entire event print. I'm only getting the message that I intended to code, which is a key press and then the number for that key. Let's add more to this. The next thing I would like to do is affect a color change. And the way that I'm going to accomplish a color change is by pressing the mouse buttons. So that's a different kind of event type. I have a code block here on condition of key down, but I want to code for a different type of event, which is mouse clicking. So I'm going to write an elif, another condition. If the event type is not key down, then we can test it to see if it, by event type, in a list where 5 is the old integer value for mouse buttons being pressed down, and 1025 is the new integer for the event type of mouse buttons down. And I'm in the habit, which is a good one to be in, of saying what kind of event that is, so that when we add more event types that we respond to, we know where in our code we are coding for these types of events. Mouse button down now. So there are several mouse buttons. The most common is the left mouse button, which has an integer value of 1 for its attribute button. So if that button is equal to 1, then we'll make a comment, left button. I've gotten to have created a place in my code. This code block will now be where I respond to the event being a mouse button pressed down, and specifically that button being the left mouse button. So what do I want to do in this case? I want to change the Boolean color change to be equal to true. I'm assigning color change to be true. And I can code more, but let's see the effect. I can still pause, and now if I press the button, it did a color change. Red is the color that everything will be drawn if the Boolean color change is equal to true. But notice that I can keep pressing and it doesn't change it, it's already red. So the Boolean was set to be true and is now permanently true. I want to now allow the color change Boolean to be set back to false. But I'm going to do it differently than pause. I'm going to code it so if the mouse button is been pressed down, the Boolean will be true. But then as soon as I release that mouse button, the Boolean will turn back to false. In other words, this effect, the color, is going to be red if I hold the button down, and then blue if I don't hold the button down or when I release the button. That's a different event type to detect the release of a button. Event type 1025 is specifically just a press down. So I'm going to make another code block very similar to this. I'm going to copy it and paste it, and then make some changes. 6 is the old integer value for the release of a mouse button, and 1026 is mouse button up, or the release of the button. And event button 1 is still the left button. But in this case, I could change it so that any button is released. I've changed this condition a little bit. I'm going to change the color change Boolean will be true if the left mouse button is pressed down. But for the purposes of showing, I'm going to change the color change to be false on the release of any button. So technically, I could release another button on the mouse, and this event will be true. It does not have to be the left button. So I have the object blue. If I press and hold the left mouse button down, I'm still holding it, it's red. As soon as I release the mouse button, then it turns back to blue. So this is a hold effect. Now I can, though it can't be shown on camera, I can hold the left mouse button down and then keep it down while I press the right button and then release the right button, but still keep the left mouse button held down, and it changes back to blue. That's because the particular way that we coded for it only cares about the release of any button. It doesn't have to be the left. That was done for the purposes of demonstration. we have one last thing that our code can do that we haven't affected yet, and that is duplicate our instances or create more of them. So the way that we're going to create more of them is on the pressing of the D key. One thing we could do if we don't know what the D key's number is we can run our code and press the D key, and our code is prepared to tell us what number that is. This is a common thing to do when we add events to our program. So I'm going to run our program, press the D key a few times, and learn that it has a key number of 100. So I remember that, and I add to my code that if the event type is key down, so I'm going to add to this block, I'm going to write an elif to check a different key. In this case, 100 is the D key, and I'll make a note of that. Then I want to duplicate. All I need to do to duplicate, because I've set this up, is turn that duplicate Boolean to be true. And if we remember from the previous, if the duplicate is true, it'll turn it immediately false in the frame loop, so it only does it once, and then it produces a new instance with that new key. And this is on condition of the D key being pressed, so I'm going to run my code. Pause is still affected, color changing is still affected, and now I'm pressing the D key to create lots of instances. And of course, they're all affected by the pausing algorithm, and they're all affected by the color change algorithm. So we have different kinds of input, keys and mouse, key down, key up, mouse down, mouse up. Now you. You have seen how to affect changes based on the events in the event queue produced by various forms of user input. Start with this lesson code file and add at least 2 new effects. Make the color change that pressing the mouse button produces only happen when the animation is not paused. And make it so that pressing down of the K key deletes one of the object instances. So we have our program now can be paused and the color change still works. Figure out how to make the color change not happen even if you're pressing the keys when it's paused. We also can press the D key to duplicate things. Press the write code so that the pressing of the K key deletes one of these at random. Have fun.